In the Shoshone National Forest, the wind doesn't just blow, it mimics. And tonight, it's using the voices of everyone I've ever lost to tell me one thing: the routine is over. The false echo, the midnight radio. My name is Silas. For the last 3 seasons, I've worked as a fire lookout in the Shoshone National Forest. My office is a 15 by 15 foot glass box perched on a stilts 60 feet above the canopy. It's a life of extreme solitude, measured in lightning strikes, cloud formations, and the steady, comforting crackle of the long-range radio. Out here, the wind doesn't just blow, it talks. It whistles through the struts of the tower and moans in the valleys until your brain starts to turn the noise into words. You learn to ignore it. You learn that the forest is a master of illusions. 2 nights ago, the routine broke. It was 2 a.m. and a dry thunderstorm was rolling over the horizon, the kind that starts fires without a drop of rain. I was tracking strikes on the map when my personal cell phone buzzed on the desk. I don't get service up here, that's the rule. But the screen was lit up and the caller ID sent a jolt of ice through my veins. It was my sister, Clara. Clara passed away in a car accident in Ohio 3 years ago. I didn't pick up. I couldn't. I watched the phone vibrate against the wood until it went dark. But then, the tower's official emergency radio, the one connected to the park ranger's frequency, began to hiss. "Silas, are you there?" "It's so dark at the bottom of the stairs, Silas. Can you come down and help me?" It was her voice, perfectly preserved. It had that specific, shaky breath she used to take when she was scared. But the sound wasn't coming from the radio's speaker. It was coming from inside the radio's housing, like the voice was trapped behind the glass of the dials. I grabbed my binoculars and scanned the base of the tower. My high-powered floodlight was dead. The wires had been chewed through, or so I thought. Looking but tension, in the faint strobe of the distant lightning, I saw a figure standing at the very bottom of my stairs. It was wearing a yellow raincoat, just like the one Clara used to wear. It was looking straight up at me, but as the lightning flashed again, I realized its face wasn't a face. It was a flat, pale surface that looked like it had been molded out of wet ash. It had no eyes, but it was staring exactly where I was standing. Then, the creature did something that made my heart stop. It reached up and tapped on the steel leg of the tower. Clang, clang, clang. The sound vibrated all the way up into my floorboards. And then, my phone buzzed again. A text message. No number. Just 3 words. "Invite me up." I backed away from the glass, my boots thudding hollowly on the plywood floor. The emergency radio wasn't just hissing anymore. It was breathing. A wet, rhythmic sound that matched the pulse in my own ears. I reached for my heavy-duty flashlight, the one that could cut through a mile of mountain fog, and clicked it on. The beam sliced through the dark, illuminating the spiral staircase that led down into the abyss of the pines. The figure in the yellow raincoat was gone. The space at the base of the tower was empty, save for the swaying shadows of the lodgepole pines. But the tapping didn't stop. Clang, clang, clang. It was closer now, much closer. It wasn't coming from the base of the tower anymore. It was coming from the steel grating, just 10 feet below my floorboards. Something was climbing, and it wasn't using the stairs. It was hauling itself up the support beams with a metallic, scraping sound, the sound of bone-dry talons dragging over galvanized steel. "Silas, it's so windy out here," the voice whispered. This time, it didn't come from the radio. It drifted up through the floor vents, clear and crisp, as if Clara were standing right outside the trapdoor. "I can see your light, Silas. It's so bright. It hurts my eyes. Turn it off so I can come home." The smell hit me then. It wasn't the scent of the forest or the oncoming rain. It was the smell of old, stagnant water and wet wool, the exact smell of the riverbank where they found Clara's car. The air in the cabin became cloying, humid, and heavy with the scent of decay. I grabbed the heavy iron poker from the wood stove, my knuckles white, as I stared at the trapdoor in the center of the floor. The bolt was thrown, but the wood began to vibrate. "You're not her," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Clara is gone. Get off my tower." The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that feels like a physical weight pressing against your eardrums. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then the radio erupted, not with one voice, but dozens. "Silas, this is dispatch. We have a report of an unauthorized person at your station." "Silas, it's Dad. Open the door, son. It's cold." "Look out, full. This is Ranger Miller. Do you copy? Silas, open the door." All of them. My father, my old boss, the ranger I'd talked to just that morning. Their voices were layered on top of each other, creating a chaotic, discordant harmony that made my head spin. It was a sensory blitz, a wall of sound designed to shatter my resolve. I looked at the window, a hand, pale, translucent, and with fingers that were at least 3 inches too long pressed against the glass. It didn't have fingernails, just sharpened points of yellowed bone. The Clara in the yellow raincoat was clinging to the outside of the glass, 60 feet in the air, her face still that flat, featureless slab of ashen skin. It leaned closer to the glass. A mouth began to tear itself open in the middle of that smooth face, a jagged, vertical rip that revealed rows of needle-thin teeth. "Silas," it said, using the voice of the woman I had buried. "The routine is over. Let the echo in. The echo in." The glass began to crack. The first crack in the reinforced glass sounded like a pistol shot. I watched in frozen horror as a jagged line webbed across the north-facing pane, right where that featureless, ashen face was pressed. The creature didn't flinch. It simply leaned more of its impossible weight against the tower, its needle teeth chattering in a rhythmic, clicking sequence that vibrated the very air inside the cabin. I knew I couldn't fight a thing that could climb steel struts like a spider, but I knew the physics of this tower. My mentor had once told me that the radio equipment up here wasn't just for talking. It was a high-frequency antenna capable of generating a massive amount of electromagnetic interference if the limiters were stripped. "You want a voice?" I gritted my teeth, blood beginning to leak from my nose as the infrasound pressure intensified. "I'll give you every voice in the valley." I lunged for the signal booster, a heavy, rack-mounted unit beneath the primary console. My hands were slick with sweat, but I managed to tear the safety housing off. I didn't need to transmit. I needed to create a feedback loop. I grabbed the external PA microphone and jammed it directly into the high-gain output of the amplifier. The screech that erupted was soul-tearing. It wasn't just loud. It was a physical wall of white noise that made the glass rattle in its frames. Outside, the creature recoiled, its ashen face distorted, the vertical mouth slit stretching wide as if it were trying to swallow the sound. The yellow raincoat it wore, that leathery mimic skin, started to shiver and slough off in wet gray clumps. "See, lass, stop. It hurts." The echo. The voice was a mess now. It was switching between Clara, my father, and the park ranger every few seconds, the pitch warping and deepening until it sounded like a dying engine. I didn't stop. I pushed the gain to the red line. The tower began to hum with a violent, electric energy. I could see blue sparks dancing on the metal edges of the desk. Sant Elmo's fire. Triggered by the sheer amount of local frequency I was pumping into the air. The creature's long needle fingers began to smoke where they touched the glass. It let out a final, mournful whistle, the same three-note tune from the woods, and then it simply let go. I watched the yellow blur fall. It didn't scream. It didn't flail. It just dropped 60 feet into the dark, disappearing into the tossing tops of the pines. I slumped against the console, the feedback still screaming in my ears. The silence that followed when I finally cut the power was terrifying. It felt like the world had been hollowed out. I looked at the cracked window. The glass was still there, but the breath on the outside hadn't evaporated. It was a thick, oily smudge that smelled of stagnant river water. I reached for my thermos to steady my hands, but as I tilted it back, I stopped. The emergency radio, the one I had just pushed to the point of a meltdown, flickered back to life. There was no power running to it. The wires were melted, but the speaker crackled with a low, clear signal. "Silas, this is Clara." That was a loud noise, Silas. "Why are you being so mean? I'm still at the bottom of the stairs, and I brought the others." I turned my flashlight toward the base of the tower one last time. In the next flash of lightning, I didn't see one figure in a yellow raincoat. I saw dozens, an entire crowd of them, all wearing the faces of people I had known, all standing in a perfect silent circle around the base of my tower. And they all started to climb. The sound of their climbing was like 1,000 insects scuttling over dry leaves. The steel struts of the tower groaned under the weight of a dozen bodies that shouldn't have been there. I could hear the rhythmic clink, clink, clink of those bone talons finding purchase in the rivets. The glass box that had been my sanctuary for 3 seasons now felt like a display case in a museum of the dead. I didn't try to fix the radio. I didn't reach for the flare gun. I knew that the others at the bottom of the stairs weren't just mimics anymore. They were a collective memory, a physical manifestation of every voice I had failed to save. Silas, why are you staying in the light? The voice was a perfect crystalline overlay of my father and Clara. It was coming from the floorboards now, vibrating through the soles of my boots. The shadow is so much quieter. The cracked window finally gave way. It didn't shatter outward. It imploded, the shards of glass falling onto the floor like diamonds of ice. A hand pail, veined and dripping with that oily river water sludge, reached through the gap. Then another, and another. The featureless faces began to pull themselves over the sill. In the dim glow of my dying flashlight, I saw them. They didn't have eyes, but they moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace. They didn't attack. They simply surrounded me, their long, tapering fingers reaching out to touch my clothes, my hair, my skin. The smell of wet wool and stagnant water was suffocating. I felt the coldness of them, a deep, ancient chill that seemed to slow my heartbeat. "I'm not coming with you," I whispered, though my voice felt like it was being swallowed by the humid air. "You are already here, Silas," the collective voice replied. I looked down at my own hands. In the flickering light, they were turning pale, the skin smoothing over, the lines of my palms disappearing into a flat, ashen surface. My reflection in the remaining glass was fading, the features of my face melting away like wax near a flame. I reached for my logbook, the only thing left that recorded my name, my routine, my life. I scribbled the final entry with a hand that barely felt like mine. 3:45 a.m. The voices have found the frequency. The tower is no longer a lookout. It is a broadcast. When the morning sun finally broke over the jagged peaks of the Shoshone, the tower was empty. A relief ranger arrived 2 days later, concerned by the radio silence. He found the cabin door wide open, swinging in the mountain breeze. The glass was broken, and the equipment was melted into a chaotic heap of plastic and copper. But there was no sign of Silas. No footprints in the mud, no struggle, no blood. The only thing he found was the logbook, sitting open on the desk. The final page was covered in a thick, oily smudge that smelled faintly of a river. And sometimes, on the quietest nights in the valley, when the wind dies down to a low, rhythmic thrum, the rangers say you can still hear a signal on the old emergency frequency. It's not a distress call. It's a 3-note whistle, followed by a voice that sounds like a dozen people speaking at once, all of them saying the same thing. Routine check. Look out for. The echo is perfectly clear. Look out.